All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight. My name is Scott Arena, Director of Business Development for Income Property Management, and I will be your host and moderator for tonight's policy panel. We have an impressive lineup of dynamic industry experts with us this evening to share their thoughts and provide a high-level overview on the impact of the pandemic upon the region's housing. These are interesting times, to say the least. Renters, owners, and operators have all felt the change and associated uncertainty as we navigate a new and uncharted landscape. At the outset of 2020, COVID-19 impacted us all and changed our world forever. Millions of people's lives were thrown into uncertainty, and people were scared. Swift action was needed to address the widespread economic effects of the state of emergency and the social distancing required to stem the spread of the virus. One of those impacts was a sudden spike in unemployment, unlike anything our state had ever seen before. With many Oregonians out of work and struggling to meet financial obligations, our governor and legislators passed a series of executive orders and laws meant to provide additional protections for people who could not pay their rent. Now, after nearly a year of Oregon's state of emergency, Oregonians are facing hundreds of millions of dollars in back due rent and tremendous additional uncertainty about how those additional protections will conclude. With that, I know we're all anxious to hear from our panelists tonight. This group will provide you, our audience, with sharp insights to the COVID-19 rental housing crisis and explore policy options that will safely transition Oregon from a state of emergency while protecting renters, housing providers, and Oregon's rental housing supply. Now, we won't have a Q&A section or session after tonight's presentation, but I ask that you please direct any questions you may have for the panelists to the link in the chat box. The email link will be myhousingstory@multifamilynorthwest.org. Multifamily Northwest will later share answers through an email update and provide an FAQ on the website. I will also ask that our panelists wait until after everyone has had a chance to make their presentation before they ask questions of one another. So with that, let's get started with our first speaker for this evening. Marcel Gesmundo is senior counsel in the litigation department at Greenspoon Martyr, where his focus is on housing law. For the last decade, Marcel has represented tenants, small mom and pop landlords, large management companies, housing authorities, nonprofits, and trade organizations, all providing him a broad view of the different perspectives on housing. Marcel has an expansive knowledge and deep understanding of housing law. He also teaches multiple courses on all aspects of housing law, including local, state, and federal levels. We're looking forward to Marcel sharing an overview of the various rental housing laws related to COVID-19 and the important changes they have made for renters and housing providers. I can personally attest to the time and energy Marcel devotes to teaching, as I believe I've attended at least 4 or 5 of his classes over the last few months. And with the number of changes with the housing bills recently, it feels like I'm registering for an updated class about every 2 weeks. Don't take this personally, Marcel, but I'm kind of getting tired of seeing you. In all seriousness, though, thank you for your valuable instruction to our industry, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks for the introduction, Scott. It's always nice to see you. Tonight, I have about 10 to 15 minutes, and I have 10 to 15 minutes to talk about the state of the law and kind of how the industry has responded and how the laws have changed over the course of the last year in light of COVID-19 and the various moratoria that have been enacted. But before I do that, I think it's really important to kind of put these laws that have been put in place for tenant protections kind of in their proper context. And so if you can give me the next slide. The moratoria that have been enacted, they take place in a specific context. And of course, owners and residents, they both operate under basic landlord-tenant law, and landlord-tenant law really just balances the rights and obligations of both, owners and residents under various circumstances, whether it be, in screening before someone becomes a resident, whether it be during the tenancy, things like upkeep, and then of course how each party kind of ends that relationship. And these laws are in flux; they're constantly changing as new obligations and rights and duties are created, and as those rights and duties are kind of adjusted as policymakers see fit. But despite all those changes, really the fundamental basis of how the housing industry works, right, is it's based on a simple premise that an owner provides housing and that the tenant in exchange pays for the use of that housing. And so that's really the fundamental building block of how the housing industry works. And it's really the fundamental basis on which kind of all these other rights and duties kind of are adjusted through various laws. So if I can get the next slide. But even that most basic of this relationship, that was adjusted kind of as we entered beginning of 2020 with the global health crisis and COVID-19 and the attendant economic disruption that came with it. And from my perspective, what really happened was there was huge concern from policymakers over the impact that a potential huge increase of evictions might lead to. And that led policymakers to kind of respond through a series of quickly enacted temporary legal measures of indeterminate length. And that sounds contradictory. How can something be temporary and indeterminate, right? But let me unpack that slightly, because what I saw the policymakers doing as they enacted the moratorium I'm about to talk about is nobody knew what COVID-19 would do, how long it would last, how quickly people would be able to respond to it and get it under control. And so what we see is a series of kind of short-term measures that have an end date to them, but they might not have an end date. They're kind of tied to the end of an emergency period, whether that's set by a local jurisdiction or by the governor's emergency declaration. So in that sense, no one's quite sure when they'll end. And in addition, they have kind of this collective impact that makes them feel somewhat indeterminate, because we've seen through my last count, I think about 15 measures that have been passed, whether at the local, state, or federal level, that have impacted housing and tenants and owners in Oregon. And each time that those measures are about to expire, it seems that at the last minute, they're either extended or something else is enacted to take their place. And so it's that kind of succession of these, what are kind of deemed as temporary measures or kind of reactionary measures, they keep getting implemented. And so what was initially intended to be kind of temporary has really expanded in scope quite broadly if you look at them in their totality. So you have things that were enacted in the beginning of March, and you kind of really see them start to develop in April of 2020. And here we are now, and I don't think anyone expected this, but we're now in February of 2021 with measures that are extending all the way through the end of June. And so that's what I really mean by it doesn't feel as though this necessarily has ended or will end, even though we have an end date currently in sight. We just don't know whether we can really rely upon it. Next slide. And to kind of look at this, what you really see is you kind of see this patchwork of overlapping moratoria that are enacted to ensure the protections of tenants impacted by COVID-19. And again, you see them at the local level through both the counties and towns and cities. You see them at the state level through the governor's executive orders, as well as through the special sessions that enacted various laws, including House Bill 4213 and 4401. And then you even see the federal government taking action through the CARES Act, which was passed in March, and then even the CDC, right? So you're seeing it at a variety of different levels from different perspectives. And just by way of a quick recap, when COVID was really hitting at the very beginning, in February, and March, we had the governor kind of declared this as an emergency, but Multnomah County was the first to kind of act. And so in March of 2020, Multnomah County enacts an emergency rule and then an ordinance, which basically says landlords are not going to be able to take any action if the resident can come to you and notify you before the rent becomes due that they're not going to be able to pay and they've been impacted by COVID-19 in some way. And then they can actually kind of show it. They can demonstrate an actual hardship. And then you see some of the other jurisdictions kind of pick this up, and you see Beaverton, you see Hillsborough, you see Clackamas County and Portland. They all kind of follow suit with a similar requirement. And then the governor acts in April. The governor says, all right, I'm gonna enact an executive order which prohibits law enforcement from actually carrying out any evictions for non-payment. And then Multnomah County steps in again and they say, okay, well, we're going to change this slightly. The tenants no longer need to prove any hardship related to COVID. They're going to get these protections automatically. So owners are prohibited from taking any action with regard to non-payment, kind of through, it's going to be basically through June. And then after that time, they're going to get 6 months to repay what they've incurred, between now and June. Well, the governor enacts Executive Order 20-13, and without the 6-month repayment period, essentially extends the same protection statewide. So again, owner cannot take any action to enforce the right to rent through that same period of time. And so you can start to see it's starting to build right now, right? You see the local jurisdictions changing things, you see the governor changing things. And then in the middle of that, the CARES Act is also enacted, which protects certain tenants in certain properties if they're subsidized or whether they have a federally backed mortgage, and there can be no action taken for non-payment through July. So we're kind of seeing this now, this overlap of all these different policymakers essentially trying to accomplish the same goal, right? They have these concerns over the pandemic, but also simultaneously concerns over the economic impacts and how those two things might interrelate. And so as we kind of get to the end of kind of this first wave, or maybe even a second wave, the special session is called House Bill 4213 is enacted, and it basically takes that Multnomah County model and builds on that and extends it. And they say, okay, for tenants statewide, any charges incurred between April 2020 and September 30th of 2020, no action can be taken. And those residents, they're going to get 6 months to repay that. They're going to get until March 31st. So that seems to be the solution, right? We've now quite a bit of kind of breathing room has been built in. It's kind of been standardized for the state. But then you get into September, right? We're starting to get close to the end of that emergency period. Residents would have to resume paying for October on time moving forward. And the CDC then passes something for the entire country, which says if the tenant hands in a special declaration, the residents in the entire country, they're going to get until the end of the year. And then the governor reacts and enacts Executive Order 20-56, which extends those same protections through the end of the year. So it kind of harmonizes the CDC. And this, so now we've gotten all the way from April's non-payment. Now it's extending all the way through the end of the year with an eventual repayment at the end of March. That's kind of the basic framework here, right? So again, owners can't take any action, and the residents, these protections are provided automatically, so it applies to everybody. Well, then eventually Multnomah County acts again, and they kind of create their own repayment plan, which has a kind of a weird overlap. It's going to give people essentially till 2022 to repay quite a bit of debts. And then another special session is called, and then we get House Bill 4401, which really just takes this whole framework and they extend it out even further. And I'm not going to talk about the policy reasons because I don't know exactly why, other than they want to ensure that there's not, the overarching concern seems to be a concern about a wave of evictions. And that is going to give essentially everybody. I think it's easy to say there's going to be limited exception, but it gives almost everyone the right to be worry-free of kind of having to pay anything that they've incurred from April of 2020 all the way through June 30th of 2021. So you have this 15-month window, and the ownership, the people who are providing this housing, they can't do anything about it. So normally the remedies here, and again we talked about earlier, there's this existing backdrop of what the law normally is to govern these relationships. And the landlord or property owner, the housing provider, they have a limited toolkit of what they can do. And it's really limited to, they can assess a late fee normally, or they can require the tenant to pay or to move. But those tools have been removed. And so there's really no right without a remedy, in this case, to the rent, at least through the end of June, right? It may resume in July. If I can get the slide. And so, these restrictions, and I have some dates in here about when they end, because they ended at various times, but I think, in a short 10 to 15 minute presentation, we don't have time to dive into the details of every single law that we just listed in the last slide. It's too much. I think you need to take a step back and look at kind of the cumulative effect of what these laws do, right? And so they protect the residents, but from the owner's perspective, here's what they do. The owner, for much of this period, was not able to move into the property if they needed to, or move a family member in. So if they had a rental, but they needed to move in or move a family member in, that wasn't available, at least until October statewide, Multnomah, Portland, through February. If the landlord would have had the right normally to kind of retake possession without cause, because they wanted to sell it, they weren't able to do that, to sell that property. There was also restrictions on the ability to kind of remove residents if the landlord had intention of demolishing or renovating it, because they wanted to develop or rehabilitate the property. So that was no longer an option. In addition, there's kind of some ambiguities in the law that make it questionable on, even after the residents vacate, whether the owner can actually pursue them, because there are restrictions on the ability to kind of send things to collections, to file a civil suit, and it's possible that ownership can't even do something, even though these laws seem to be intended to protect people who are currently living with one landlord. It seems to extend beyond that. The owners can't even actually discuss these things with their residents, except under circumstances where they provide kind of a long list of disclosures, attachments of certain rights that they have to notify the residents of, and this new declaration that is actually what kind of triggers the residents' right to get this extra period of time. But number 6, though, number 6 is the biggest change to the whole relationship, right? It does remove the owner's ability really to enforce that payment, that basic foundational element of this entire industry, which is owner provides housing, resident provides payment for housing. And that's, I think, if you're going to focus on anything, that's the thing that changes the most, right? And that's where the residents are receiving the biggest protection, but at the same time, when you adjust rights and remedies, that's where the ownership is impacted the most. And these protections really come with minimal to no proof. So the resident gets them automatically. You don't know necessarily whether they've been impacted, or they just have to submit a declaration. So the threshold to receive the protections are somewhat low. If I can get a slide. And I think when you look at the readjustment of these rights and remedies, it's also important to kind of think about what was left out. What could have been in there that wasn't in there. And so I get a lot of questions from people that says, well, I'm as an owner having some issues and challenges here because I'm not receiving rent, or I can't do these things. What's been done for me? Have these types of things been done for me? And the answer is generally no. So ownership doesn't get protections from the banks. Ownership doesn't get protection from utilities. So if the ownership pays for the utilities, whether they bill it back to the resident or whether that's part of their overhead, there is no protections for them from those utility companies. There's no suspension of taxes currently. And there's really no suspension of any other duty, such as the duty to maintain, the property, to furnish utilities, or any other requirement of the owner that would necessitate them paying some overhead or even capital improvements. So those things aren't a part of this existing law and framework. Slide. What has been done is there have been some measures that have been enacted to kind of support the owner. And one of the things originally passed was ownership could assess this half-month penalty if the tenant didn't engage with them in the process, tell them that they were going to use the grace period to pay this back. Well, that was the one thing that owners got with HB 4213, but it was removed when House Bill 4401 was enacted. But 4401, of course, creates the biggest support for ownership, and that is what's been dubbed the Landlord Compensation Fund. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, even though the Landlord Compensation Fund, at least the $150 million that's been set aside, can only be applied for the owner. It's really both a fund that's to support owners as well as residents, because the residents actually receive the biggest benefit of this program. And what it does is, if the tenant hands in the special new declaration, then the owner can then apply to have the state, if they're approved for their application, to pay off 80% of that application. And so for a building, let's just say of 100 units, if 20% of the people hadn't paid rent, they could apply for that unpaid rent for the residents who actually hand in the declaration. For tenants who don't do it, you don't get it. The application is competitive because we don't think it's necessarily going to have enough money to cover everyone. We'll see about that. And it's scored and weighted in such a way to where the preference will be given to smaller owners, meaning owners who manage less units, and also to owners with higher delinquency rates. And so, but the catch is, if you apply and your application is approved, you have to waive 20% of that gross revenue for that application. For the money that you apply for, you have to waive 20% of that. And if you get the 80%, so you do also have to forgive this. The requirements are still kind of in flux, and OHCS is the entity that is implementing this program. But in doing so, they've had to react very quickly and to kind of give them at least a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. They've had to kind of implement this and put safeguards in place. But in doing so, we only have about 6 days till the application period opens. There's so many questions from so many landlords, and there's still a lot of questions unanswered about the process and about what the requirements are. So there's still a lot of uncertainty, even in the landlord compensation program. Slide. So kind of just in closing here, again, when you step back and you look at all this and you're looking at the entire patchwork of these moratoria, I think it's important to also look at the potential impacts, right? And kind of where we are currently in light of them. And so I think one of the big impacts is that there is uncertainty for owners and tenants on whether the rent will be paid and if it's going to be paid when. That still remains to be kind of uncertain. Even though we have an end date of House Bill 4401, and we're in session right now, and you can see the number of bills currently being proposed. And so everyone's not really sure what's going to happen next. There's also uncertainty over the state of the law. When you have this many laws passed this quickly and they're all effective on passage, there is, sorry, 1 second, as I have my co-counsel trying to join me. Sorry about that. There's also a lot of uncertainty over state law, and people don't know necessarily what the law is. They haven't had time to catch up and catch their breath. And as someone who teaches a lot of these classes, people are still trying to learn the law, and I think that is probably going to apply to tenants as well. And then kind of lastly, and this is just a segue, I think, into to the economist section, is that there's uncertainty over what the long-term impacts of this will be, because we don't know when you adjust the landlord-tenant relationship, and when you adjust what the rights and responsibilities of each party are, especially in ways as significant as this, especially when you change the building block of how the industry works, there is a big question on what those short, medium, and long-term impacts might be. And with that, I thank you, and I'll hand this back to Scott.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Thanks for that clarification and uncertainty and confusion. And I think you're being called to dinner. Thanks for your co-counsel's participation too. All right. Our second panelist tonight is Jerry Johnson. Jerry is the principal at Johnson Economics, a consulting firm serving a diverse mix of clients. Jerry has consulted on the economics of land use planning and real estate for 28 years and is recognized as a top expert in the field of land use economics. He has managed over 600 projects, working with a range of private and public sector clients. Jerry is also a member of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors for the state of Oregon and is an adjunct professor at Portland State University's Center for Real Estate. This evening, Jerry will be sharing his analysis of the economic impact of Oregon's COVID-19 rental housing laws and their influence on housing supply in Oregon, both immediate and long-term. Jerry, I've had the pleasure of listening to your presentations over the years, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how Oregon's housing market has been impacted over these last several months, and especially what tomorrow may look like. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jerry.
All right, thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. What tomorrow's going to look like is always a tricky question. We're great at telling you what happened, but what's going to happen in the future is difficult. If I go to the next slide, I want to thank Marcel for bringing up the whole concept of uncertainty. Because what we're going to be talking about is the housing market, and the housing market is essence an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem. When you start playing with it, you have to be very careful. Because small things have large impacts in ways you may not anticipate. And uncertainty is one of those things because the market hates uncertainty and it punishes or charges for uncertainty. I guess that punishes. So we're taking a look at this basic overview. What we're going to talk about today, or I'm going to be talking about today, is really what has happened because of this fundamental change in the contractual arrangement between a housing provider and tenant, which is really the underlying foundation for all housing, which is basically we have assets, we assume we're going to get a certain level of income for them, and then that allows housing to be provided. We're going to take a look at the impacts in the market from different perspectives. One is the property owners, second is tenants, third is investors and lenders who have a perspective that's a little different than either of those. Trying to talk about the magnitude of the issue, basically how much of an issue is this? Is there adequate funding for it? And an evaluation of some of the prospective policy actions and how those impact the market. So if we go forward, next slide, please. So taking a look at the different things, and this is a direct impact, which is basically what things you can figure out right away from just looking at a moratorium. First of all, for the property owners, obviously it's a reduction in their ability to respond to lost income. What that means is you don't have a lot of the recourse or ability to minimize your collection loss, vacancy collection loss, and because of that, we would expect it would be slightly elevated, maybe heavily elevated, depending on who you are. And inherent in the way this is written for the property owners, there's a requirement that you provide basically an unsecured zero interest loan to tenants if they can't pay, which is obviously a burden on the property owners. For the tenants, you can't be evicted for non-payment of rent. It's a positive, obviously, for people feeling more comfortable that they have more housing security. You still accrue the balance and you still have the obligations that remains in place. So you're not getting a waiver of rent, you're just getting some grace period on the rent. But you do get to basically borrow that money at zero with no payment or back rent penalties, as long as you can still make the payment. And for lenders, it's important to recognize that most real estate properties, particularly income properties like rental apartments, typically secure loans, and they're an asset securing the loan. We're expected a likely increase in defaults or need to restructure loans because of drops in incomes to the property owners, investors. And there's potential regulatory impacts. The Federal Reserve or the federal regulatory agencies have not responded well to the fact that lenders have loans secured by assets that they are not allowed to actually take control of. And some of this gets beyond the moratoriums and gets into some of the banking regulations that have come into place recently. You go to the next slide. One of the things that we start taking a look at from the participants, though, and this sort of breaks them a little bit more, is some of the secondary impacts of things you don't see right away. First of all, for developers, is reduced lender and investor interest in holding the asset class. By asset class, I mean rental residential property. If they see both uncertainty as well as less of an ability to basically hold up their contractual obligations and collect their rents, then they're going to be less interested in that particular asset class. This is important because it affects some things we typically refer to in the industry as capitalization rates. What it really are is returns that are required to hold the asset class. So what investors will require if they're going to do certain development types, and that affects values as well. For lenders, again, it's their lower security interest in debt secured by rental residential assets and tighter underwriting standards because of that, both of which are likely to reduce the level of debt available as well as change the lending terms that are less advantageous to do development. For investors, again, it's the same thing. Do I want to hold rental apartments as an asset class, and how do I adjust for what I perceive as higher level of uncertainty and higher level of risk in that particular asset class? And for tenants, the concern is that there'll be less new product and lower vacancy because of lower development activity, increasing rent environment, because a lot of the things we're talking about, and we'll get into them in a little bit more detail, and much more detail in the white paper that we're issuing, or I'm issuing on this. And there's an inflationary impact of a lot of these changes in the environment, and probably some tighter tenant screening, since now I'm going to have a lot of reliance on my tenant, and I've lost a lot of my ability to control my vacancy collection loss. Next slide. So we're trying to look at some of the things to get an idea of what the magnitude of the issue is. And the data sources are really hard to find. And most of them weren't tracked until the start of this recession. And one of the things you'd want to know is what the baseline condition was prior to the pandemic response, because there's always a certain level of underlying collection loss and vacancy loss that would occur in any market to begin with. One of the data sources, Multifamily Northwest, has been doing their rent survey, started in May of 2020, and taking a look at basically percentage of occupied units unable to pay. This is at the state of Oregon level and by the region. The first one is on class on the left-hand side, which takes a look at class A, B, C, tax credits, and overall. And you don't see enormous amount of fluctuations, but keep in mind, all of this was done after while the pandemic was fully in place. We do see occupied units unable to pay by region bouncing around a bit, with Central Oregon taking off of late, Portland and Salem peaking in November, but sort of recovering a little bit, and Eugene staying low. These are still bouncing around at a relatively high levels, because if we're talking about late payments, those are pretty significant numbers still, if you look at the overall inventory of housing stock in the state of Oregon. Next slide, please. The other thing that's been done of late is they called a pulse survey that U.S. Census Bureau started, but again, it started in response to the pandemic, so it doesn't have a long data scene. We do take a look at expected loss of employment, which is shown on the left-hand side. That shows obviously that things were slowly improving until we got the recent surge, and then employment losses go up again. But we have seen a building housing insecurity percentage of households bouncing a little bit more in Oregon, but it's a relatively small sample set nationally, relatively upward. But I think it starts dealing with the cumulative effect for particularly low-income households of some of the duration of this pandemic, which has been surprising to me as well as probably them. I also we see certain things like the unemployment insurance benefit supplements really helped out a lot. In fact, unusually, the people laid off, actually, several of them in the lower income categories actually had higher disposable income early in the years when they had the very high supplemental unemployment insurance benefits, and there's been some patches in that and at a lower rate, but some of that's still out there. But we do see a building level of housing insecurity in the market nationally and within the state. Next slide, please. One of the things they also did the survey is they asked people for their, they do this survey every week. This survey was middle of January. And so they asked people, Oregon and nationally, their likelihood of leaving home due to eviction. Now, we had the moratorium in place, so these numbers, people either are not aware of the moratorium or weren't quite figuring, but I assume that they're perceiving a reason that they could be evicted as opposed to actual expectation of eviction. But they may have actual expectation because they may not be aware that the moratorium's in place. More notably, confidence to pay the next month's rent. Oregon actually does a little bit better than national average on this, but still is only slight to no confidence for over 20% of the households of their ability to pay their rent in the next month. And that's as of January. So I guess that would be February month. February rent. Next slide. And then the National Multifamily Housing Council, which is largely Class A product, newer product. So it's not representative of the entire market, but definitely shows that trend where rent collections were getting better in the summer and they're starting to go down again. So percentage of rent collected by the end of the month dropping a bit. It's not remarkably high, but again, these are largely Class A product. And what we've seen with this particular downturn or recession is it's been really disproportionately impacting the lower spectrum of the economic of the workforce. So basically lower paid jobs, because primarily in the service industries and restaurants and lodging and hospitality have been the ones that have taken the brunt of the impact, who are largely not probably in Class A product. Next slide, please. So one of the big issues we worry about with the moratorium is the impact on housing production. One of the things we talked about is the fact that investors and lenders having lower interest in the product type and tighter underwriting requirements. We're already in a situation where the Portland metropolitan area has been underperforming as far as kicking out rental product or housing product relative to our demand, which is one of the reasons we've seen rent increases. The concern is that if investment yields need to be higher for rental apartments, that's going to basically put an inflationary impact, because you need to get higher rents to generate the higher returns. And it's not just of new construction, but new construction basically sets the price for the entire spectrum of product in the market. So when new construction costs more and the older construction is trading at a 20% discount to new construction, a 10% rise in new construction costs and necessary rents, yields a 10% rise in the older product as well, because it still maintains that same differentiation of 20% discount or whatever it is. So we can't ignore the impact of new construction on overall pricing, because when replacement costs, which is for the economic term for what it costs you to deliver housing, goes up or yield requirements go up, it makes all housing more expensive in the market. And then next slide, please. This is, I think it's illustrative, but it's probably too hard to read in a short time period. We've got a better description in the white paper I'm working on, but basically what it talks about is you get a relatively modest change in the market capitalization rate, which is necessary rate of return. It means that I've got to get higher rents to basically provide the return necessary to do this. And I guess for a more illustrative way than this is if I need a 5% return for an investment, to justify the investment, then I have a certain level of rent. If I need to get a 6% rate of return because I perceive that there's more uncertainty or higher level of risk, that means I've got to raise my rents 20% to get the same level of return. Everything else held easy, is held the same. And that's really the concern here when we get into this, is we start changing the market and playing with the market in a way that the market then reads as entailing more risk, and therefore higher rates of return necessary to invest in the market, and therefore I need higher rents to justify investing in the market, which has an inflationary impact across the spectrum again. Next slide. Shouldn't have included that, was too complicated, so sorry. There's an issue for current property owners. One is loss of revenue, obviously, if that happens. Now, there may be a lot of programs in place that help offset that, which is positive. And again, almost every policy that offsets the impacts is positive, because it's a bit like going back to the ecosystem analogy, if you've got a problem in the ecosystem and you find a way to mitigate the problem, you reduce the overall negative impact on the ecosystem. So they've got potential reduction in asset value. This is another issue that comes in if we see higher rates of return requirement for different products, then I'll pay less for it, and therefore my product is worth less. There's also potential for cash call, which people who invest in real estate know that's when I take a look and I understand that the asset value isn't what it needs to be to justify the loan, and therefore you've got to come up with additional equity, which is a big deal. And there's a lot of volatility risk for small property owners who, it's one thing to take a look at the odds and say, I've got 250 units and I can figure out the 2% shift in industry. If I've got a fourplex and I'm a small retired couple, you know, a 25% drop in income because one unit goes south is a big deal for me. Next slide. Renters tenants, again, security is better. You haven't gotten away from your obligation though, and it still stays in place. And I think there's potentially the reduction of single family homes available to rent. One of the issues we've got is a lot of families now have been unable to get in the single family housing market, which is getting away from them. And to the extent that rental looks relatively less interesting for an investor class, it's more likely they're going to turn over and sell those homes to the market, reducing the level of single family, which has been a big issue. Single family rentals, a big asset that's important for a lot of families. Next slide. And there's a lot of policy responses being kicked around. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because we can ask them questions as they come up. There's rental assistance, things that are basically tenant-based. There's short-term loan programs to basically reduce some of the issues of debt-free requirements, debt-free lending requirements that basically go to the property owner, and some direct relief for the property property owners, which is also welcome. But again, anything that we can do to basically mitigate the disruption to the market, I think helps the market's ability to function efficiently, and efficient function of the market is what gets us affordable housing, and I think helps the entire market. Next, I think that might be it. Oh, summary. Well, we'll just go through the summary. I already did the summary. So I'm over my time, so I'm going to let this thing go. Happy to talk about all this stuff. We'll have much more detail as this thing goes forward.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Some great analytics there. Appreciate that summary. Our next panelist this evening is a colleague, friend, and well-known name in our region's multifamily real estate market. Deborah Imse has proudly served as the Executive Director of Multifamily Northwest for 20 years. Multifamily Northwest is the leading association of housing providers in Oregon and Southern Washington, whose members manage over 200,000 plus units in these areas and represent every service related to the industry. The association is dedicated to promoting a high degree of professionalism for rental housing providers, owners, and partners. The organization offers a year-long calendar of educational programs, including fair housing, both federal law and Portland's Fair Housing Ordinance, respectful workplace training, and state-specific housing provider law in Oregon and Washington. Throughout the pandemic, Multifamily Northwest has been at the forefront of tracking the need for robust rental assistance and tracking the impacts of Oregon's new housing laws upon renters and housing providers. Deborah will be sharing a series of policy recommendations that will chart a pathway to address back due rent in Oregon and prevent both evictions and major rental housing inventory loss. Deborah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Good evening. Multifamily Northwest has 2,500 plus members who own or manage more than 270,000 units of affordable workforce and market rate housing in the state of Oregon. We have heard this evening about the actual laws and the possible impact on housing supply as we move forward. I would like to give you a lens on how these regulations are impacting folks on the ground that are actually caring for Oregon renters and their rental homes. Housing providers are deemed an essential service and as such have been operating in a unique regulatory environment that many of you may not have been familiar with. As Marcel mentioned this evening, this includes 4 separate eviction moratoriums, city, county, state, and federal, all with a matrix of conflicting requirements, effective dates, and consequences. Two major pieces of legislation, House Bill 4213 and House Bill 4401, resulted in 15 urgent industry alerts to our members, each requiring numerous changes to forms and procedures to prevent incurring severe penalties. Jerry spoke to the global cost of regulation. When we survey our membership, we hear consistent feedback on the following points. Dramatic loss of income, in some cases forcing property owners out of retirement to avoid losing their investment. Providers being forced to sell their properties, no longer being able to self-manage due to complexity and risk, and communication that has broken down between the provider and the tenant. And finally, deferral of maintenance and capital improvements. Here's a small sample of what we heard in September. I am a single teacher who owns one rental in Portland. My renter has not paid a dime for months, and as far as I can tell, has no intention of paying. It's difficult to say because not only does she not need to provide any connection to COVID-19 to justify not paying, I'm not even allowed to ask when she might be able to pay again, as this could be construed as pressure. As I type this, I am close to tears. I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare. I'm burning through my savings to pay my living expenses and the mortgage on my rental. I've been hanging on by a thread until the moratorium is lifted. That was 6 months ago. In January, we are now hearing stories that speak to the impact that this will have on the supply of rental housing. This is from a small owner. I am going to have to sell. My tenants have not paid rent for 6 months. I can't afford to keep the property without rent. I will have to sell. The regulation is literally ruining my livelihood and my life. Many private owners I know are going under. This has been devastating to me, to my family, and our community and economy. While these stories are difficult to hear, our empirical data backs up the true toll this has taken. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Multifamily Northwest has collected rent survey data that has helped inform policymakers throughout the state. The January 2021 rent survey represented 341 surveys collected and over 90,000 market rate and tax credit rental units in Oregon. The key findings in the survey were as follows. On average, in January of 2021, 11.7% of Oregon households did not pay their rent by the 15th of the month. Of renter households living in affordable tax credit units, 9.2% were unable to pay rent, compared to the average of 14.3% for 2020. We believe this is due to several rental assistance options that were targeted to affordable housing in the fourth quarter. Conventional Class C workforce housing experienced a 16.2% inability to pay rent and showed virtually no improvement from 2020. There is cause for concern that rental assistance dollars are not reaching tenants in this asset class, and their need exceeds those of households living in affordable tax credits, which offer more resources, case management, and programs. Notably, Class A market rate apartments in Portland now reflect a 10.3% vacancy rate on top of a 9.6% inability to pay. It should also be noted that the past year has presented new opportunities for collaboration between public and private sector. The data we just presented was collected with the generous help of our membership, Oregon Housing and Community Services, 5 housing authorities, and the membership of other Oregon housing associations. It has been a huge team effort. This collaboration also produced a weekly hot sheet of immediately available housing, which was used by housing case managers helping people displaced by wildfires. The total amount of rent arrearages in Oregon has been difficult to come by. Portland State University recently quoted the National Council of State Housing Agencies that rental arrearages are 378 million on the high end through last September. By our estimates, the number for January of 2021 alone is approximately 125 million. The total will certainly be well over 500 million by July 2021, making rental assistance a critical part of the solution. What solutions do we recommend? First, foremost, and always, we recommend robust rental assistance. However, this rental assistance must be administered in an efficient process that streamlines the delivery so that both renter and housing provider know how to utilize the system. Currently, there are two models for administering the available funding. The first model is the customary method of delivering assistance. The tenant applies for their household and the rent is paid in full on their behalf. In the new Housing Provider Compensation Fund, a housing provider can apply on behalf of all the tenants who need help. In this model, the housing provider must forfeit 20% of the rent owed with no recourse. Further, it appears that many housing providers will not qualify for this fund. In the data we showed you earlier, tenants living in Class C properties have been disproportionately impacted and have the greatest need for rental assistance. In evaluating the Housing Provider Compensation Fund, it appears unlikely that funding will flow to those properties. As you can see from the point system chart for the program, properties with 40 or more units and arrearages of up to 25% receive very low scoring and will be pushed to the end of the line on each funding round. The date you apply does not matter. The score you receive establishes priority. We believe the funding will go quickly and there will be not enough rental assistance to make both the renters and the housing providers whole after the toll this terrible pandemic has taken. Rental assistance is only part of the solution. Fortunately, Senate Bill 330 would offer complete rent forgiveness for renters and allow housing providers a chance to recoup the debt that is owed them. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our insights with you. And with that, Scott, let's move to our final panelist.
Thank you, Deborah. Staggering numbers, indeed. Our final panelist this evening is a member of our Oregon State Legislature. Senator Betsy Johnson is the Oregon Democratic State Senator from Senate District 16, proudly representing the most northwesterly portion of our state, from Scappoose to Astoria and everything in between. Senator Johnson was first elected to the Oregon House of Representatives in 1999. She began serving her third term as a representative before her appointment and subsequent election to the Oregon State Senate, and has now served as senator for 15 years. Since first winning election, Senator Johnson has been a member of the Joint Legislative Appropriations Committee that determines state budget policy. We're excited to hear about her legislation, Senate Bill 330, which provides a tax credit for rent loss during Oregon's COVID-19 emergency. Senator Johnson, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're honored to have you and greatly appreciate your time and look forward to hearing about this legislation and how it will impact stakeholders in our housing communities. Senator?
Thank you very much. The previous speakers have laid out the problem statement very clearly. So I am especially pleased to be with you tonight to present Senate Bill 330. This concept was offered in advance of the third special session as Legislative Concept 880, but leadership had already committed to a different path. The House committee proposal, which ultimately passed, was, in my opinion, insufficient in a number of respects. First of all, it does not rescue most tenants from ultimately having to file bankruptcy or face eviction. It does not come with compensation to landlords for the executive orders that required them to basically provide services for free. It doesn't come close. It requires current funding that doesn't exist, and our budget situation continues to be very dire. And finally, it exposes the state to significant takings claims that are possibly represented in a lawsuit that has already been filed. So when the Senate President called me in advance of Special Session 3 to tell me that LC 880 was not going to advance on December the 21st, he urged me to submit it in the 21 session. I did that, and it now appears before the body and before the public as Senate Bill 330. It will be heard in the Senate Housing Committee. I have already spoken to the chairman, and he has given me assurances that it'll be heard towards the end of this month. And then it has a subsequent referral to Senator Burdick's Committee on Tax Credits. So let me explain why I believe Senate Bill 330 is the clear solution to a number of problems. First of all, it is clearly what's best for tenants. These are good people who have suffered enormously through no fault of their own, and frankly have been sweating out what to do. The current bill has a means test, or the current proposal has a means test for landlords. And as you have already heard from the previous speakers, it will favor the smaller landlords and not-for-profits. So if a tenant lives in a big complex, or if a landlord owns a big complex, there's a very good chance that you could lose out, as demonstrated by the last slides. Senate Bill 330 helps every tenant, every tenant. The second thing that it does is it fairly compensates landlords forced to be basically unpaid social service agencies. I'm told by reliable sources that as many as 15 or more percentage, and you saw it tonight in the presentations, of renters have been living rent-free while the expenses for the landlords have continued. The third reason that I think Senate Bill 330 is a superior solution is that it fixes the landlord's problems without the use of current revenue. It's funded by future revenues when, God willing, our economy has picked up. And last, it, I think, saves the state huge, huge legal exposure if the current lawsuit is successful. Tenants, frankly, ought to love this legislation. A landlord cannot take the tax credit if the tenant is evicted, so there's an incentive for the landlord to work to keep the tenant in place. I'm delighted to report to you that as of later this afternoon, Senate Bill 330 became a bipartisan bill. Senator Lynn Finley, who lives in Ontario, had sponsored Senate Bill 87. On his review of Senate Bill 330, he came to the conclusion that my proposal was a superior proposal. He has offered to abandon his bill and be a co-chief sponsor on Senate Bill 330. That means that we have both sides of the state represented. Senator Finley lives in Ontario and represents a much more rural place. I, of course, am in Northwest Oregon. So I genuinely believe that Senate Bill 330 offers a universal solution. Landlords are able to put our tenants are able to put their head down on a pillow for the first time, not worrying about future bankruptcies or judgments that could be ruinous to their financial future. Landlords are made whole, and I offer it for your consideration. I have reason to believe that there are legislators on this call. I would welcome your help and support on advancing this concept. I think it is equitable. I think it is common sense. I think it solves a plethora of problems. And I would hope that other legislators would see this as a positive approach to a very significant problem, as detailed by the previous speakers, and that we could work together to pass this, I believe, common sense solution for both tenants and landlords. Thank you very much for allowing me to join you this evening. And I offer Senate Bill 330 for your consideration and hopefully your help.
Thank you so much, Senator. I'll turn it over to Deborah for a few comments as well.
Thank you, Scott. We're asking the broader housing advocacy community and allies to support Senate Bill 330 because it protects both renters and housing providers. We know that rental assistance alone will not be able to meet the demand. Please reach out to your state legislators and let them know this creative solution will provide the housing stability that our state needs. Thank you.
I might just add, if I can jump back in here for a
Oh, sure.
second, that in the time that you were talking, I now have a House chief sponsor. Somebody just texted me and asked if they could sign on. And we also have had questions about providing talking points and a text of the bill, and I'm sure that your organization will do that. I would be happy to reduce my talking points to writing and send them to you.
Thank you so much, Senator Johnson. And of course, we will do that. We will be, and I'll get this back to Scott, we will be answering questions that may have been posed at the site that was mentioned at the beginning. Scott, I'll let you wrap that up.
You bet, Deborah. Thank you. Yes, all audience questions can go to myhousingstory@multifamilynorthwest.org. That is in the chat room as well, that link. Well, we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to close out now. A sincere thank you to each of our esteemed panelists this evening. We greatly appreciate your expertise, your valuable time and insights provided. With that, I'll conclude the panel presentation and also thank all of you, our audience, for attending. Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and hopefully very soon we can do events like this in a more of a face-to-face manner. Good night, everyone.